Right. All right, guys, looks like we are live, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hello, and welcome to the Baha'is Exploring Social Justice webinar series. My name is Leslie Garrett. I'll be your host for the evening. Today's
Hi guys, looks like we are live, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started.
Hey, you can hear me. Double up.
Hello, and welcome to the Baha'is Exploring Social Justice webinar series. My name is Leslie Garrett. I'll be your host for the evening.
Today's topic is gender and race inequality, spiritual approaches to our global challenges. We are so honored and excited to have Dr. Robin Chandler with us to share her insights.
Today's topic is gender.
I'm going to just close that part out. We're so excited to have Dr. Robin Chandler here to share her insights. She's going to be speaking on gender and race inequality, spiritual approaches to our global challenges. Dr. Chandler practices international development as a gender specialist, most recently in Uganda and Liberia under the auspices of the CIES Fulbright program, with a focus on democratization and social movements. She is tenured faculty and a former department chair of ethnic studies and current director of women's studies at Northeastern University. She co-wrote Women, War and Violence, Personal Perspectives and Global Activism, which documents the impact of war on women. Dr. Chandler is a highly sought after gender advocate and thought leader who has spoken in China, Turkey, Zambia, Botswana, Great Britain, and Australia. She is a former Fulbright Scholar and a National Endowment for the Arts recipient. She has been a member of the Baha'i Faith since the 1960s, has consulted for the National Spiritual Assemblies of Puerto Rico and Bermuda, and has served Baha'i communities and schools around the world. Welcome, Dr. Chandler. We are so happy to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Leslie. Hello, everyone. And first, I want to wish everyone very happy Intercalary days, happy Yamiha. And I hope you're all going to woman up for the fast and get yourselves together so that we can garner all those great insights, those spiritual insights that are waiting for us with the assistance of the Supreme Concourse to help make this a better world. So we need this fast, and I wish everyone happy sailing. The title of this webinar is Gender and Race Inequality. By definition, gender equality and racial equality is what we're looking towards, spiritual approaches to our global challenge. And one of the things I want to say about this faith and this religion is that Baha'u'llah has come at a very particular point in history, a couple of centuries ago, with a completely new vision at a rather critical time in human history when everything seemed to be going wrong and everything seemed to be going right in the 19th century, when we're turning this big corner on enormous sweeping human rights movements that include the end of the slave trade and slavery, the beginning of women's suffrage, the launch of industrialization, challenges, and the end to child labor, and all sorts of sweeping social movements and issues are happening in the 19th century. And apparently, to my way of thinking, it was so bad, so corrupt, so challenging, so exciting that we needed twin manifestations. So it's the first time in human and religious history that we have two manifestations coming within the same century. And that ought to give us some idea of what the challenges are that face us. One of the other things that's happening in the global Baha'i community is that there are a lot of tensions in our communities, as beautiful as they are. And there are tensions around race, there are tensions that concern gender issues of all types. And there also are enormous issues around what is, from my point of view, an extremely middle-class religion in many respects, and also some sweeping issues in terms of intergenerational gaps. A lot of generations of people aren't communicating and talking to one another, and we desperately need this in our Baha'i communities to revitalize our vision of the future. So one of the things that I wanted to jump to in this webinar is to try to think about gender and race from a scientific point of view. And by that, I mean, how can we use reason and intellect and intuition, all of these faculties we know that Abdu'l-Baha has told us we have, how can we use these to actually address many issues that center around gender discrimination and racial discrimination in the Baha'i community? We know that they exist outside of the Baha'i community, but I think a lot of us are deeply concerned that they also exist within the Baha'i community. So I'm going to move right away to the second slide, and one of my famous and favorite quotes, which is, "Be ye as firmly settled as the immovable mountain in the cause of your Lord, the mighty, the loving." And I've made up this new signal for those of us who want to feel greater spiritual solidarity around issues of gender and race by taking my inspiration from this quote. So from now on, when we see one another and we are trying to be as firmly settled, we're trying to be immovable mountains in the cause of our Lord, the mighty, the loving. And this clenching of the fist, which is might and power, with the discerning aspects of love, will keep us all in check as we're moving through discussions of racism and class discrimination and gender discrimination inside the Baha'i community. They're very challenging. So first of all, we're going to go to some myth busting. That quote, by the way, is taken from the Kitab-i-Aqdas. And what's significant about the writing of the Kitab-i-Aqdas is that Baha'u'llah is writing the Kitab-i-Aqdas simultaneously with the writing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution. So at the moment in US American history, when secular law is being solidified, Baha'u'llah is writing spiritual law that's going to determine the course of human civilization for the next 1,000 years. So there are a number of events that I'll point to here and there during this webinar that are aspects of some data that I shared at Greenacre last March that show these enormous coincidences or seeming coincidences that happen in the century that the twin manifestations have come, and these sweeping secular events that are happening in human history that are focusing on two of the most significant groups that the Guardian has asked us to focus on in terms of our teaching. And those are African Americans and First Nations or Native American people. You'll hear me talk about those two groups of people collectively, because all too often we forget discussions about First Nations people in our Baha'i communities when we're talking about race, because we deal with them separately. And I'm not going to do that because of a number of things that include the fact that my personal subjectivities are mixed. And so as somebody who is a woman of color, I represent statistically, and I'm speaking as a sociologist now, statistically, most of the people in the world look like me. They're women and they're brown or they're Chinese. Those are most of the people in the world. They also happen to be most of the people in the world who are marginalized and who have been oppressed for thousands of years. So when we're talking about the coming of Baha'u'llah, we're talking about Baha'u'llah coming to transform humanity around issues of the equality of men and women and the elimination of all forms of prejudice that have been in place for thousands of years. So we're going to start off with this slide here with some of the myths that I think need to be busted inside Baha'i community life. The first is that there is a code of conduct in Baha'i community life, and we all know what that is. It's rectitude of conduct and chastity and all those things. But I'm adding to this that to be a Baha'i, you need to be a feminist. You need to be an anti-racist and free of class prejudice. Now, I'm sure in the course of this webinar, I'm going to get a lot of cards and letters from people who are spoilers, and that's okay. I'm used to that. But we really need to create a climate where we can talk about racism and we can talk about gender discrimination. We can talk about abuse. We've already had some extraordinary webinars here on BESJ, and I want to take my hat off to the brothers and the sisters of BESJ who've created a regulated platform for us to talk about hot topics. So once again, thank you BESJ for providing this fora for a lot of Baha'is who feel comfortable talking about this and who need to air some of these issues. The second point is that there is a conspiracy of silence concerning the existence of racism, gender bias, mental illness, human sexuality in the Baha'i community. And, You'll recall in Leslie's introduction that she mentioned I had done some consulting for 2 national spiritual assemblies. And interestingly enough, it was around some of those issues. Issues around which there still happens to be a conspiracy of silence about. We have some very Victorian ideas in the Baha'i faith about not speaking about human sexuality or mental illness or the other issues that affect our community just as much as anyone else. And we need to face those and then face them down, sort of like the Marines do, in order to come to grips with them. The third point is that there is no clergy in the Baha'i faith. I know that we all know this, that Baha'u'llah disbands the clergy in the 19th century, but sometimes we have a cult of personality operating in the Baha'i faith that makes us feel as though some people are more important than others. And fortunately, that's not true. And so I want to talk a little bit during the course of this seminar about trying to dismantle the cult of personality that we might have, that in a way is an effort to try to recreate a clergy in a kind of subconscious kind of way. The next thing is that racism and gender bias are not flaws, they're not shortcomings to be overlooked with a sin covering eye. They are patterns of thinking and behavior that are evil, systemic, pandemic, and in some cases illegal. So the point here is that you'll oftentimes be confronted with people who will suggest that you not talk about racism because you should have a sin covering eye. And what I'm saying here is not. That's not the case. This is not a flaw or a shortcoming. This, as a social scientist, is a pattern of behavior and a pattern of thinking that has infected our Baha'i communities, and we simply have to eliminate it. It's as simple as that. These are not my words. They are the words of the Guardian. So I want to remind people, please don't shoot the messenger, because the Guardian has said that in order to address the issues of teaching both Native American and African American folks, that we do have to deal with these issues inside, because people in those communities are not going to want to stay in our communities if we're not confronting these very challenging issues that many people outside the Baha'i faith are confronting. So that it's part of our project. And in the course of this webinar, I'll also show you a slide that breaks down and compresses the language that the Guardian uses in what I call a behavioral model for eliminating racism that also applies to gender prejudice. So next issue is both Indigenous, First Nation, and African American people have been strategically exploited for 8 centuries, up to and including this century. That these are facts. They're not alt facts or fake facts. And when the Baha'is want to address racism, it's because the beloved Guardian said that we must feel that responsibility upon our shoulders. Those are his words. So that we need to understand that, for example, in the case of First Nations people, the first massacre that was a documented massacre of First Nations people was in 1325. The more recent one was in 1911, a year before Abdu'l-Baha comes to the United States. And so First Nations people have been experiencing 8 centuries of exploitation and oppression. And so there's no way we can forget those histories. We may be ready to forget them, but we need to understand what they are first. And I'll get back to that in a moment. The next point is that we are both spiritual and civic citizens of the United States, and our understanding of social inequalities needs to be deepened, not shallow. And so we have to understand the facts that bear upon the social inequalities that exist in our country, whether we're talking about mass incarceration or convict leasing from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, or unequal schools in the United States, or gender-based violence. Whatever we're talking about, we need to understand what the facts are, what the histories are that communities of color have been confronted with for centuries. So one of our responsibilities as Baha'is is to inform ourselves, not to rely on people like me to share that knowledge, but we have a plethora of resources, often online, through which we can educate ourselves about the true histories of communities of color in this country. And we need to do that. The next thing is that the calamity oftentimes referred to in the writings has been underway in the West for centuries. It's another way of repeating what I've just said. We sometimes as Baha'is are waiting around for the other shoe to drop. And what we see is a calamity. But the calamity for people of color has been here in place as a dynamic system of oppression for an extremely long time. This is the reason why Baha'u'llah and the Bab have come to try to help us engage and confront those histories. Next is to address biases. Science and business has proven that smaller teams have a strategic advantage and are more productive if they function inclusively. And what I'm saying here is that sometimes we think that we have to do things on a large scale, but we're also reminded of the fewness of our numbers. And the Guardian has often told us not to worry about that. And he's absolutely accurate in the sense that business as industry has now proven that some of the most productive people work in small groups to get things done. Next is that most women and people of color have lived through centuries of apocalyptic scenarios. And as such, they possess inherent spiritual insight. Some of this is related to the pupil of the eye phrase that you've oftentimes referred to as being associated with African Americans, and that's something that we understand. But people who have experienced oppression have precious insights to share with us, particularly because they have not only survived, but transcended those circumstances. And so we have a great deal to learn from them. And so one of the things that is significant in terms of understanding how racism functions if you're white is to develop superior listening skills, along with spiritual qualities, but superior listening skills. So that we really can begin to take in the lived histories and the experiences of people who are different from us. Then the more we listen to women and people of color in the Baha'i faith, the more their input will be understood as indispensable. So it's not just listening to people, but really understanding that those insights can be translated into new ways of thinking as we build a community life. Lastly, we need to be ahead of the pack and the curve and the community so that we can fulfill what Abdu'l-Baha has said about America, is that we will lead all nations spiritually. And that one I know is a big stretch for a lot of us, because we can't imagine a nation that's in the condition that it is now will one day eventually lead all nations spiritually. But if he said it so, it must be so. Next is ways to confront inequality. And I'm talking here about moving from truth to reconciliation to healing. You've heard probably about reconciliation and its association with nations that have undergone war, whether it's Liberia or Argentina or many other nations that have experienced long-term war. But we have in effect been at war around issues of race for 8 centuries. And the country was really constructed around segregating the races. And so we have to remember that part of our challenge as Baha'is is to hear the truth stories that come from communities of color about what has actually happened. So, for example, would it surprise you to know that approximately 65 people were lynched in 1912 during the year that Abdu'l-Baha came to the United States, and that those statistics continued on into mid-20th century? And so part of what we need to understand is when we're asking people to forget the past, do you understand the past that you're asking people to forget? Do you know the facts? And we need to look very closely at the language that the Guardian has given us, and we'll do that in a subsequent slide. So first he said, it hath now become evident that these teachings are the very life and soul of the world. So it's important to understand the indispensability of these teachings, particularly the teachings about eliminating all forms of prejudice and establishing the equality of men and women, how central they are to the life and the soul of the world. Because I'll say this many times, is that we're not building another material civilization. Humanity has built material civilizations for about 6,000 years around the world, and we've gotten very good at that. But we have never yet successfully built and sustained a spiritual civilization. And that's what we Baha'is are being asked to do, to build a spiritual civilization at the behest and with the guidance of the divine architect. And so the spiritual civilization that we're building requires us to go through these stages of truth, reconciliation, and ultimately healing. So almost all of our institutions have been corrupted by racism and gender harassment. We're well past the age of race amity and well into the need for anti-racism, feminist frameworks, class divisions, and critical race theory approaches to eliminating all forms of prejudice. Now, these issues, this language may be more comprehensible to younger generations of people or to people with more intellectual orientation. But the fact of the matter is, it's the common parlance of the younger people of this generation. And so one of the things I'm going to focus on, particularly with BESJ, is that we're looking at and need to focus on the young people, the younger generations of people, not my generation, but the younger generations of people who are going to build this spiritual civilization. And this is the language that they use. This is the way they view the world. It will be their world. They will rule it. They will govern it spiritually as Baha'is. And so they understand that we need to approach these issues from a critical standpoint. So let's do the math. Millennials, for example, there's a lot of talk about them. Did you know that they were the most diverse and the best educated adult generation in human history? And that by 2028, they would be voting. They would be the largest cohort of people voting. And this forecast is reflected in the current movements that we're seeing in the news right now that are about anti-gun laws, BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, the No DAPL movement, and many, many other movements that are taking course in American history right now that we hope will have a long-term sustainability, that they will actually affect social policy and they will affect laws that will at some point begin to put in place the transformations that need to happen in this country. So demographically, the US is already a minority majority nation. If you live in Texas and California, you already know that's true. Some of the rest of the states don't quite know that that is the truth, but that shift in being a minority majority nation is really going to have a lot of, create a lot of disequilibrium in this country. It already is. Because of the myth that this is a white-dominated, white-owned, white-controlled country, and that it is going to remain in the hands and under the control of white males. And so we all know that that's not going to be true, that that's going to change. But even with a minority majority nation, we don't know that all of the transformations that we know need to happen in the United States are going to happen just because more people of color are in positions of power, because of the institutionalized nature of racism, the systemic practices of racism that are so much more difficult to undo and dismantle. So take initiative in Baha'i community life. One of the things we can do is having men and boys who listen to, learn from, and actively collaborate regularly to support girls and women in the workplace, in the family, in the community, in the neighborhood, and assist with childcare at Baha'i events. So this would be a huge event, because this conversation about gender equality or inequality isn't just about women. And that's something that we always have to remind ourselves. It's about men and women. And the principle of the equality of men and women is also about gender inequality as it's focused on men. So we always have to be thinking about ways to address the challenges that men face, the challenges that women face, the disproportionate social arrangements that benefit masculinity, but also challenge the souls of men. So there are a number of quotes in the writings, we'll get to them in a minute, that talk about the harm that the practice of racism and the practice of gender discrimination have on the souls of men. It's warped all of us, not just discriminated against women over centuries. It has actually harmed men and harmed the way we think about what equality ought to look like. So Baha'i men and boys can organize men's groups in their communities. And I've talked to a lot of people around the country And it seems like this is a growing initiative, and it could become part of the Institute process in Baha'i community life, and extremely important, I would say even indispensable, that men and boys develop men's groups and become literate and conversant in how to talk about inequality and how to develop collaborations and support systems with girls and women. We need to raise our Baha'i boys to respect women. We need to raise our Baha'i girls to be self-assured and confident. And we need to make sure that all the systems that we're going to put in place in our Baha'i infrastructure are going to treat boys and girls equally in our faith, so that we can become a model for the outside world about how we feel about the equality of men and women. We should champion inclusion as a daily routine. And a lot of this has to be done by praying for tests, which I know we make a joke of a lot in Baha'i community life, but that is kind of the way we do it. We pray for tests, the tests come, hopefully we confront them. Sometimes we even pass them. But it's really important that we focus on champion inclusion as part of our daily routine, along with prayer and meditation and service. So wake up in the morning and pray for a test around inclusion, and ask God to give you an opportunity to deal with the concept of inclusion in a different kind of way, way beyond your family and your community. What can I do to demonstrate the equality of men and women, or anti-racism to the people I come in contact of an average day? Next, we want to be comfortable and smart in making interventions when you see someone in distress or subjected to racism or misogyny. A lot of us are exposed to this on a daily basis because it's everywhere, inside our Baha'i communities, outside of Baha'i communities, in the workplace, in the school, in the media. It's everywhere. We're surrounded by it, and there's no way that we can't be infected by it. But we have to find safe and helpful ways to not be a bystander. And I think most of you who are listening know what a bystander is. And certainly Abdu'l-Baha was not a bystander. He was probably the opposite. And I oftentimes refer to what he does as servant leadership. You know, he comes from another country to the United States in 1912, and he basically says, you and you, get married. You and you, come up here and sit next to me. You and you, come with me. We're leaving this hotel. It's segregated. I mean, that's real servant leadership. That demonstration of where we should have been in 1912 as a Baha'i community was a clear expression that the Baha'i community should be much farther advanced in its understanding and practice of anti-racism and gender equality. So he's an important person to remember and call on for support. The less the diversity is present or acknowledged, the less we learn, the slower we grow. You could start a conversation about race as we did in Boston in August of 2016. A conversation about race is a conversation about race. And if you want information about that, I can give it to you afterwards, but we're starting small, a small initiative that spread to many other parts of the country, and we hope that you'll join in that. But it's a safe space inside the Baha'i community to talk about race and racism in a healthy way, in a spiritual way, and through the guidance from letters from the House of Justice and the writings on the social discourses of society. The next one is no games. And we play a lot of games to avoid confronting racism, to avoid talking about racism. There are many occasions on which I've either had direct experience with, or thousands of stories that I've heard over the 48 years I've been a Baha'i, that ask us such questions as, why do you people always have to bring up the R word, the racism word? And, you know, that's one of the games that we play. And I've got a good deal of work that I do as a trainer on a long list of games that we place about race and gender that prevent us from actually dealing with the reality. So, for example, one of them around racism is Find the Racist. And in Find the Racist, we look for the person in the room or the group or the community who's committed some of the most egregious acts of discrimination. we nail that person and we think that that obviates us of any responsibility in dealing with our own racism because we've named that person as the embodiment of racism. And that's a game. It's not helpful. And it distracts us from the hard work we have to do internally to address racism. So there's a long list of games, but I'm not dealing with them here. Next, attend, develop, or advocate for diversity training and follow up policy and performance assessments. This is something that I've specifically recommended for those of us who work in public and private spaces. If you don't already have diversity training, if you don't already have equal rights training, if you don't already have diversity officers in your business, it's something you as a Baha'i could very well advocate for. And you can also be a watchdog of it to make sure that the institution of the business isn't just doing it for compliance to federal regulations, but they're actually doing it because they value diversity and they want to sustain it over the length of the business or the community. Next, become a home front pioneer. I see some of these methods are all over the map, but everybody has got something they can do on this list or a few things that they can do on this list to address racism and gender prejudice. And so home front pioneering is one of them. I mentioned this last August at ABS during the panel on race with my made up word called MOVE, meaning move out very expeditiously. Move into the Chicano community, move where the Vietnamese are living, move near the African Americans or the Cape Verdeans, move where the Boricuas, the Puerto Ricanos are moving, but move out of your ethnically specific enclaves into these spaces where people of color are living so we can bring them into the faith and so you can challenge yourself around personal transformation issues. Many people have done it. It can be very successful if done properly. Then develop a zero tolerance for racism in yourself. That's a longer story, but it's on the list here because eliminating racism really begins with yourself. And that's something you have to do in your private time with the Creator on a daily basis. Serve on a local spiritual assembly. This sounds like a no-brainer, but the reason I'm raising it is because we Baha'is tend to have this extraordinary sacred and spiritual electoral process, but I think sometimes we sort of misrepresent it in that the same people get elected over and over. And these are our local houses of justice that will be adjudicating issues of injustice for a century to come. And everybody in the community needs experience serving on a local spiritual assembly. So if we keep electing the same people over and over, that eliminates the spreading around of the opportunity to have on-the-job training, so to speak, in consultation and in focusing on real problems in our communities. It also prevents a lot of burnout that happens with Baha'is who serially get elected for 20 or 30 years to the assembly and deprives the rest of us as an opportunity to serve. It also secretly, of course, is a way of saying, I don't want to serve, by not recommending yourself or not suggesting that you're qualified. It's one of those things that you become qualified and it's on the job training. And everybody, once they turn 21, should have the opportunity to serve on a local spiritual assembly. Teach youth the power of consultation, debate, and conflict resolution. We want our Baha'i youth and children to be able to discuss some of the more profound issues of this century. We need them to have the language of healing, the language of reconciliation. We need them to understand how to apply the Baha'i writings with their peers, whether they're 7 years old or 70. We've been told by Abdu'l-Baha that what other children learn in a year, Baha'i children have to learn in a month. I love that phrase. To me, it was always a challenge as a parent to try to squeeze all that training, spiritual and material, into a smaller period of time. But we've been asked to do that in this dispensation, again, because we're building a spiritual civilization, not a material one. There's several others on this list. I'm gonna jump to the second last one, which is take lessons from the First Nations water protectors, a movement that is both spiritual, pragmatic, and intergenerational. If you've watched the No Dapple movement at Standing Rock that Kevin has spoken about in a previous webinar, I'm sure that you understand and you've been able to see that this is a deeply spiritually based movement that's rooted in the sacred teachings of First Nations people. It is very much a pragmatic movement about water. And it also is extremely intergenerational in that the young to the elders are all involved in this movement. So this reminds us that the revelation of Baha'u'llah is going to thrive if we can maintain the intergenerational aspects that are so important to growth. This slide is about repercussions and backlash, and it addresses what a lot of people face when they try to address issues of racism. When women and people of color enter spaces that are traditionally white and male dominated, they're considered trespassers and are penalized in the forms of sexual harassment, racial and tribal bias, humiliation, ridicule, economic and political marginalization, violence, emotional and psychological slander, outgrouping, and contempt by men and sometimes other women. So the impact of inequality is disproportionately higher among these groups compared to men, specifically for women. And we'll get back to that in a minute. I want to try to get through some of these slides. This again is a quote from the National Spiritual Assembly. It's an excerpt, a phrase from a letter of theirs from 1997, actually, where they talk about what it means to be a Baha'i is to be different. And that it's essential that men engage in careful, deliberate examination of attitudes, feelings, and behavior deeply rooted in cultural habit that block the equal participation of women and stifles the growth of men. So there's your language, that gender discrimination and gender prejudice inside or outside Baha'i community life blocks the participation of women equally with men and stifles the growth of men. So one of the things I like to say, boiling these two things down in terms of racism and gender discrimination, is that white people have to wake up and men have to grow up. I know that's a little blunt. If you know me, that's, the easier way to say that. But the young people are calling it being woke. So I think one of the things we have to do in Baha'i community life, a lot of us, including me and all of us who have signed on to follow Baha'u'llah, is to become woke to these beautiful principles. And then finally, this next quote of the Guardian from Lights of Guidance to the faithful followers of Baha'u'llah who fully grasp the essential implications of the oneness, the principle of the oneness of mankind, so much emphasized in his teachings. Racial prejudice in all of its forms is simply a negation of faith, a repudiation in the belief in the brotherhood of man, which is, beyond doubt, the cornerstone of the religion of God. Loyalty to this basic principle should, therefore, be wholehearted and unqualified. So that's why we talk about the R word, because the Guardian said to do it, and we listen to the Guardian. So here is a breakdown of what I called the behavioral model for eliminating racism, or the most challenging issue. It's in the Advent of Divine Justice, written by the Guardian. It's a form of applied reflective practice for race, for gender, and for class. So while the left and right columns aren't labeled, I think you can figure out that one side is for Blacks and the other side is for whites. The language that the Guardian uses refers to Blacks and whites, or whites and Negroes, the shift in those interchangeable terms. Since we're in the 20th century, one of the things that's important to remember is that you have to self-define which group you're in. So, for example, there may be people who may not be African Americans or Negroes, but who have been oppressed people. And so they will find their responsibilities on the left-hand column. There may be people who, human beings who happen to be white, which is the distinction I made between white people and human beings who happen to be white. Human beings who happen to be white are people who are walking the good red road, as Native people would refer to them. They've engaged their personal transformation. It's clearly seen from their behavior that they're addressing issues of racism and gender discrimination. They're walking that path. And so they can sometimes become oppressed the same way people in the left column can, because they are defenders of oppression. On the right-hand column is for people who identify as white. And you have to think very clearly about which of the columns that you're in. Now, one of the things I'll use myself as a form of self-disclosure. I mentioned earlier that I was a woman and a person of color, and that most of the people on the planet look like me. Well, most of the people on the planet who look like me don't have the amount of education and training that I have, which makes me a little unusual, like a lot of other people, but it makes me a little unusual. And it means that I have to be more careful about the issues on the right side of the column too. These are the exact Guardian's words that are in the slide. So I'm not making this up or, coming up with new language. And so when the Guardian says abandon, their once and for all usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority usually means most of the time. Inherent means born with, because we've all been conditioned and shaped by racism in this country. But if you notice the language on the left-hand column, it's show, show, and show for people of color. And on the right, it's 4 verbs: abandon, correct, persuade, and master. And you can go into the Advent of Divine Justice and find this language yourself. But I'm just showing it here because the responsibilities for people of color are on the left, the responsibilities for whites is on the right, and you got to pick your poison, because you're responsible for these transformations that are eventually going to allow us to effectively draw in large numbers of people of color from communities of color around the country. But we have to engage these different behaviors before we do that. We've lost many people to the periphery of the faith or who've left the faith because we haven't transformed ourselves the way we should have by the 21st century. Remember, the Guardian is writing these in the 1930s. This is a very advanced, very insightful, very revolutionary set of insights that he somehow came to, given the fact that he never came to this country and never visited this nation. But he understood what was going on and what the challenges were that Abdu'l-Baha had given him. And so these specific behaviors are the things we have to focus on. So when you're reading the Advent of Divine Justice, you have to read the whole book. These terms, however, these are the behavioral changes that we Baha'is have to make. It's not optional. It's not optional. We have to make them. I have to make them. You have to make them. We all have to do them. And it's not for people, for white people to wait around for black people to do their stuff, nor for black people or First Nations people to wait around for white people. Everybody's got this responsibility, as was stated, on their shoulders. So one of the things that happens in the transformation of Baha'i communities, per the language of Abdu'l-Baha, is the rise of feminine ideals and the gradual disappearance of the power of force and coercion as a form of masculine rule. And this particular quote is important from Baha'u'llah in the New Era. The world in the past has been ruled by force, and man has dominated over woman by reason of his more forceful and aggressive qualities, both of body and mind. But the balance is already shifting. Force is losing its dominance in mental alertness, intuition. The spiritual qualities of love and service, in which woman is strong, are gaining ascendancy. Hence, the new age will be an age less masculine and more permeated with the feminine ideals, or to speak more exactly, will be an age in which the masculine and the feminine elements of civilization will be more in balance. One of the things that Baha'u'llah has mentioned that you're all familiar with is this quote about how the coming of the revelation of Baha'u'llah addresses itself to the upset of the world's equilibrium through this revelation. And so one of the things that's happened in the outside world is the equilibrium is highly destabilized. And it's destabilized because of gender inequality and the social inequalities associated with race and class differences. And we have to right those differences through the power and the message of the Baha'i teachings. It's the only way it's going to happen. This is about, again, those systemic patterns of discrimination. And this is a long list of very disagreeable things that most of the people in the world are dealing with. And it describes the specific nature of the imbalances that exist as patterns of behavior in the way people treat women and people of color, and the way they are treated, not only individuals, but also by their states and nations, regardless of what might be in their constitutions. So we create and sustain imbalance through gender inequality. Social, legal, and economic systems, practices breed and perpetuate inequality and imbalance. And these are some of the examples. In our country, one of the things that's prominent is unequal pay. And tell me why, after thousands of years and several hundreds years since the US Constitution, that women should be paid less than men for the same work, why we haven't been able to elect a woman president, all of those issues that demonstrate, even to our own country that's supposed to be the superpower of the world, why we can't seem to come to grips with gender equality. Menstrual huts, child marriage, unequal access to resources, FGM, that's female genital mutilation / cutting, exclusion from decision-making and constitution-making and governance and household decision-making. This is prominent in many parts of the world. GBV, which is gender-based violence, human and drug trafficking. Women and girls and small children, including small boys, are disproportionately represented in the statistics of human trafficking. A continuation of a slave trade that we thought ended in the 19th century, actually. And our young sister, Jaja Boyd, has done some pretty profound work in this area of human trafficking. So go follow her work. The challenge of missing women and children is at crisis proportions in the First Nations and Native American communities around the country. And the missing women and children includes murdered women and children, particularly in the Native American community. And what are the challenges that those communities face that accrued to jurisdictional issues around Native tribal sovereignty and the federal government? Some of those laws have been changed. There was a point at which white males could perpetrate injustices of gender-based violence against First Nations women and never be prosecuted. So in some places, some tribal councils, those laws have been redressed, but not all. And so we still have a serious crisis in missing, murdered, and women, children. We also have in the Native community some of the highest rates of youth suicide in the world in Native American communities, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. All of the other issues that are mentioned here. And then we want to move forward to structural inequality and the welcoming partnership. This first quote comes from the 1990 UN Conference on Population and Consumption that was held in Cairo. And this is a very important quote, a prescient quote from a woman named Bisi Ogunkeli, who was chief of women's organizations in Nigeria. And I've never forgotten this quote because it describes our crisis right now. If the rich nations of the world do not share their wealth with the poor will share their poverty with the rich. What better way to think about social inequalities and what is going to happen if we don't redress these imbalances? This last quote, the very gender inequalities in economic assets, political power, and cultural authority, as well as the means of coercion that gender reforms intend to change, currently mean that men, often specific groups of men, control most of the resources required to implement women's claims for justice. Men and boys are thus in significant ways gatekeepers for gender equality. Whether they are willing to open the gates for major reforms is an important strategic question. And this is one of the challenges at the international level with international agencies and governments, including our own, in which we try to think about how disproportionately structural inequalities disaffect and disempower women. Thus, why it's so important for us in the Baha'i world to address the equality of men and women. And this last quote at the bottom is taken out of a letter from the House of Justice. Only as only as women are welcomed into full partnership in all fields of human endeavor will the moral and psychological climate be created in which international peace can emerge. You've seen this quote, but I've translated and compressed it into what needs to happen between men and women in the Baha'i world is we need to develop a welcoming partnership. If in fact men do still maintain that control as gatekeepers of gender equality, we need to tighten the relationship between Baha'i men and women as comrades and partners of a welcoming partnership in the Baha'i world, again, so we can model that outside of the Baha'i community. This very important quote from The Guardian about being a spiritual warrior. We have to feel the responsibility upon our shoulders, arise to carry it out, and then expect divine grace to be showered upon us. That's The Guardian. World reform is personal reform. Guess who said that? Rahir Khanum. And I'm going to complete these now because we're coming to the end. I'm going to close off with this quote about the independent investigation of truth, which is so important if we're committing ourselves to eliminate racism and to eliminate gender inequality. All blessings are divine in origin, but none can be compared with this power of intellectual investigation and research, which is an eternal gift producing fruits of unending delight. Man is ever partaking of these fruits. All other blessings are temporary. This is an everlasting possession, is a kingship and dominion, which none may usurp or destroy. An eternal blessing, a divine bestowal. And so what I'm closing off with here is that if you have concerns about what status we're at as individuals, about eliminating racism and gender discrimination inside the Baha'i world, start with the independent investigation of truth. Thank you very much for being patient. And I'm sorry for railroading us through all of these slides, but let's take a few questions if possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Chandler. That was amazing. So jam-packed with information. And there were a couple questions that came in, so I'll definitely ask you those and keep an eye on the chat if you guys have questions. I know we're at time in about 3 minutes, but yep. I'd like to, if you guys can stay, and if you can stay, Dr. Chandler, to at least get a few questions and maybe get some discussion going. If you need to drop off, that's fine.
I'm fine. I'm here for you.
Great, wonderful. So the first things first, and I know we've talked about this before. These slides, can we have them?
I'll find a way to get them to you in some form. They've got all my wild and crazy notes in them, right, which are kind of all over the map. So I will get them to you in some form, absolutely.
Okay, so then what I'll do for everybody who's listening, once I get a postable, like maybe a PDF version of these slides, we'll go ahead and post them in the BESJ group on Facebook.
Sounds good.
If you don't see them there, if you want to reach out to us individually, we can definitely make sure we get those to you. Okay. Outstanding presentation from some of the attendees. And then the first question that came in a little while ago, I feel like you answered it to some degree. Let me see if I can find it. When you were, you're giving a list of things that we can do to combat these problems. But the question was with regard to interventions. Yeah. The question was, the faith has so much to address the systemic, but how do you respond immediately? How do you respond in the immediate moments to misogyny and racism?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I don't think that there's a perfect answer for everybody because every encounter is different. I think you have to do a very quick evaluation to how you can create a safe space using Baha'i principles to do an intervention. But I think what's required is enthusiasm and courage, which is one of the 4 qualities that Baha'u'llah said he liked to see in people. And, there are so many places in the writings where Baha'u'llah tells us that we have to defend the oppressed. And if somebody is standing in front of you and they're being oppressed in thought, word, or deed, by somebody inside or outside the Baha'i community, you have to stand up. You cannot be a bystander. I mean, that's just part of being a Baha'i. It's what we sign on to. But there's a safe way to do that so that you can protect the nobility of everyone. Because that nobility of our station, it has to be preserved at all times. It's not an opportunity to attack someone who you think is making a violent, committing a violent act. But I think it's very important to say a momentary prayer and immediately step in the same way you would if you were at a party and somebody was telling an offensive ethnic joke, which a lot of people put up with a lot of times, but you can't wait for that. You can't, we're no longer at a point in human history where we can put up with any form of contempt or hatred against ethnic groups or against women. We have to stand our ground and call for support from the hosts of God. You know, this language in Baha'i World Faith that Baha'u'llah talks about, and someone's asking him a question about, please define what the Lord of Hosts is. And the language that he uses is very militaristic. You know, he will behold all the impregnable forces and strong fortifications razed to the ground. He will carry his attack to the very center of the powers of the earth. We have to understand that the same as, you know, in that prayer for protection from the Bab, where he tells us, where we ask for protection, we're asking for protection above our head, below our feet, to our right, to our left, in front of us, behind us, and every other side to which we are exposed. So that every time we're about to make an intervention, remember that prayer of the Bab and move in for the safety and protection of the individual, for the protection of your own soul, and for the protection of the person, the soul of the person who's violating the individual. And we need to learn how to do this and practice doing it as individuals. We need to learn how to do this as local spiritual assemblies. Small children need to learn how to do that. And sometimes I've heard stories of kids who've done it rather successfully, but you cannot let this go. We have to be very clear with people about what the Baha'i Faith stands for. And we are unequivocal in our commitments to anti-racism. We cannot allow it to go by. You know, one of the games we play is that, you know, and I've had this happen to me increasingly so, unfortunately, and that's why I know there's something wrong with the Baha'i community, is the people who, you know, are unconsciously or consciously willing to attack me around issues of race and gender. I know that there's something wrong. And so I have to push back against that and explain to people what they're doing wrong. And then I leave them to themselves, which is what we're supposed to do. And so one of the things that we have to be vigilant about is that if we don't push back against this and call out racism when it happens and use the R word, then we risk an opportunity to allow that person to continue to perpetuate that with other people who may have less voice than us, or who may not have found their voice yet. And so it's extremely important to make that intervention in the moment, no matter what's happening. And I could give you many examples of how this happened. Without naming names, there was an intervention that was made by a white Baha'i on behalf of an African-American Baha'i at the ABS conference last fall, where the African-American individual was being attacked for talking about racism. And the white Baha'i, witnessing what was happening to this individual by a group of people, went in, grabbed the arm of the person and drew them out. That's an intervention.
Wow.
And all the person said was, so-and-so, you remember we have a meeting to go to. And one individual removed the other one from that moment. And so interventions can take a very different course and may look differently in every situation.
In other words, it doesn't always have to come down to because I noticed at the beginning of the presentation, you talked about, you know, that habit of just sort of pointing a finger and you're like calling out somebody for being racist. Like what, you know, where does that line live when it comes to those types of situations? Like when does it become something that we're doing that's, you know, taking our spirituality away from us versus something
Exactly.
that's giving, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I can relate to that. I think the challenge is that the more experience you have making these kinds of interventions in your own soul and in your social spheres, the better you get at where to draw the line about protecting your own integrity, protecting the nobility of everybody else. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but the more you do it, it's the same as physical exercise. You know, I use a lot of language: conscientious spirituality, spiritual literacy, spiritual tools, spiritual technology. We have all of the spiritual technology we need to create interventions when it's required of us. We just have to know what they are. So we know what some of the spiritual interventions are, and some of those are implementing Baha'i principles in a variety of different kinds of ways, but we do have to practice it. This is a spiritual muscle. It's like a physical muscle. And you know, when you don't use a physical muscle, my experience is that your muscles atrophy. So you have to keep using them so that they stay in shape. Our spiritual muscles that ask us to develop spiritual qualities are the same. If we don't use them, they atrophy. And Baha'u'llah has actually used this language. The spiritual qualities of the soul are not used, they will atrophy. Those are Abdu'l-Baha's words. And so if you don't get in the deep end of the pool and practice anti-racism and figure out where these lines, where the line in the sand is drawn, and it's different in every situation, you'll never gain that experience. That's what we Baha'is are charged to do.
Great. And then I just had one more question that's come in. With the role, you spoke of gatekeepers with men and women earlier. Does that role also apply to white people in relation to racism?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, white people are the gatekeepers. It's a predominantly white country, although that's changing. And you know, that we don't know what that's going to mean. Just because it's going to be a majority minority nation does not mean that suddenly we're going to have equality, because of the systemic and the institutionalized nature of racism. Mass incarceration is not going to end just because there are more people of color in positions of governance and leadership. You know, we're going to begin to see more Latinos in positions of governance and in leadership. And what they're going to be facing is systemic forms of prejudice in our public school system, in our justice system, in our business sector, in our religious sector, in academia, in higher education, everywhere. We're going to continue to see the institutionalized nature of inequality, and that it's been in place for a long time. And breaking down these barriers, people who will tell you who work in anti-racism takes a long time. One example, good example of this that I like to use in closing my response to this answer is, you know, we think about the civil rights movement that happens in mid-20th century. If you ask for an iconic name, 99% of people are going to say Martin Luther King. And, you know, I'm not going to take anything away from Dr. King. He was a remarkable person who sacrificed his life and liberty at a very young age to be a spokesperson for the civil rights movement. But if you took Dr. King out of the equation, you would still have a civil rights movement. Thurgood Marshall and a team of lawyers dismantled segregation through a rather sophisticated and plodding process of putting in place, removing the racial barriers to school segregation. Ella Baker was the mastermind behind the civil rights movement. She trained all of the people, including Rosa Parks, that dismantled that created the campaigns that ended up being related to all of the marches and the campaigns that are associated with every aspect of the civil rights movement. She was the mastermind. And many, many other people, Fannie Lou Hamer, people are from it, and a lot of other people. And so this cult of personality sometimes confuses us, particularly young people, when they're trying to create social movements that capture the imagination of people, the way, for example, the Arab Spring did. But my question always as an elder was, so what are you going to do after you've brought down this government? Are you ready to govern? Are you ready to rule? Have you thought about the aftermath of dismantling and challenging the right to rule? Have you thought about that? And so one of the things we have to get better at is training our young people about the significance of Baha'i governance, because after we've shaken the tree and challenged the movements the way we have in No DAPL and BLM and many other movements, we have to be prepared for what comes afterwards. And we have to work with our youth to train them about what it really means to be in a social movement.
Robin, we have a question that just came in, and this is actually one that I'm curious to see how you answer this. As a woman of color, it's something that I have heard from my fellow white friends say before, and I'm not sure how to respond to this. So I'd love to hear your response. The question is, the comment is, there's still a minority mentality, even when there's a majority number of POCs or women in a community. What will it take for these majority minorities to arise out of the shackles of unconsciousness and self-image?
Wow, that's heavy.
Yeah. It's real heavy, yeah.
Okay, heavy, but understandable. You know, one of the things that has happened to me, I'll just use myself as an example, because it's okay, I don't mind doing that, is you know, people will complain about me because I talk about racism a lot. And I talk about gender discrimination a lot. I mean, that's my work. And I'm accustomed to being attacked. And I always push back because, you know, I know how to push back. But one of the things that's interesting that people do, that's one of those games that I didn't articulate, is if somebody like me, who's a person of color, says that your behavior is racist, or points out something that you've done as an individual institution that violates the laws of the faith, one of the things I see happening is that white person will go behind them and find a person of color to attest to the fact that they're not actually racist. You know, that's just mean old Robin. That's mean old Jane Elliott Robin, who's, you know, forcing us to deal with anti-racism when all we really want to do is do race amity. So this is a game that white people can sometimes play, is they'll find another person of color in the community who can confirm their own feeling as a white person that they're not in fact racist. And, you know, this is all it is a game. It's a ploy. It's a distraction. And one of the things that we did in Conversations About Race in Boston is I shared my work that I've done as a consultant and a trainer on the plethora of games that we play in the Conversations About Race, so that you can close those loopholes that people try to escape through, people who don't really want to deal with race. They don't want to confront race. They don't want to acknowledge it in themselves. And we know why it happens. People's fears and anxieties begin to erupt. And one of the things that Gordon Allport said, who is a famous social psychologist, in a book called The Nature of Prejudice, it was written in the 50s, it's very old, but it's a classic. He said that you can get a person to admit that they're a liar, a cheat, or a thief before they'll admit they're a racist. And so we know that there's some antipathy, some sense of shame, and those are Baha'u'llah's words, this sense of shame that gets triggered when we find ourselves in a situation where we have to confront our own racism. It's that sense of shame that's kicking in. And that sense of shame is actually a spiritual quality. It's a good thing. If we don't have it, we're in trouble. And that's where real evil comes in. But a sense of shame is part of our subconscious, alerting us to the fact that there's some imbalance or disequilibrium in our attitudes about racism that we need to address. And so one of the things that we can do is find spaces like Conversations About Race to create more and more opportunities for people to deal with their racism based on that sense of shame. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's answered your question, but I know it's a sticky wicket, and it's oftentimes one in Baha'i community life that people try to run away from, but you've got to shut all the doors in the room so people don't have anywhere to escape, and just force people to talk about it and be in companionship with people when they're struggling with it. You know, I have two very close white Baha'i friends and one African American friend who, as a team of three, provided a workshop for a community that shall go unnamed in the past couple of years. And during this workshop, things were said that made white people uncomfortable, and they left the room. And so, I've adopted this, way of analyzing that moment that creates a greater awareness of the way in which structural inequalities have captured and boundaried the life of communities of color and women for centuries. And that is that we have not been allowed to leave the room in terms of confronting issues of racism and sexism and misogyny. We've had to deal with those things. So what right do you have as a white Baha'i to walk out of the room when these three extraordinary people have worked hard to create this opportunity for us to grow personally? So, we really have to think twice before we run for cover as either white Baha'is or people of color from what is arguably a difficult and challenging issue, but we have to do it. It's part of the roadblock that we have to turn into a stepping stone. And we have all the tools to do that in the faith. There's nothing missing. In those 7 behavioral issues that we have to address, there's nothing that the Guardian has left out for that. It's pure magic. It works. It's perfection unalloyed. And we have to go study that model personally. And if we're really Baha'is, and if we really want to change the world, we have to change ourselves first, and that's how to do it.
Thank you so much, Robin. I think that is a good place to stop. Thank you, everyone who stayed. We had a couple people drop off, but most people are still on, so thank you to all of you as well. It's been a pleasure. We at BESJ are so grateful, and we hope we can work with you again, maybe even bring you back for another session sometime, Robin, if you're Dr. Chandler, if you'd be interested. So.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I'm at your service. And I just want to also laud you folks for creating this Facebook page that you're trying to regulate as well and keep us all on our toes about our nobility, treating one another with respect and dignity. It's beautiful what you're doing, and hats off to you.
Thank you so much. Everyone have a great night. Take care.
Remember.
Yes, indeed.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Happy fast.
Happy fast. Happy Yamiyaha, everybody. Bye-bye.